How long can a human body survive without a single drop of water under the most unforgiving sun on Earth? For one man, the answer to that question defied every known limit of medical science. But this horrific nightmare didn't begin in the desert. It began with Mauro Prosperi, a highly devoted Italian family man and a fiercely competitive former Olympic-level pentathlete. He simply thrived on pushing his absolute physical boundaries. So, when a close friend mentioned the Marathon des Sables, often dubbed the toughest and most perilous foot race on Earth, Mauro found the ultimate challenge he couldn't resist. Months of precise and grueling preparation immediately followed. He trained relentlessly to conquer those shifting sands. When April of 1994 finally arrived, he was fully ready. The race kicked off with an explosive surge of adrenaline. Yet the brutal Sahara immediately bared its burning teeth. Despite the scorching, relentless heat, Mauro's athletic prowess effortlessly kept him near the front of the pack. For the first 3 days, everything proceeded exactly according to plan. He was remarkably confident, energized, and deeply in his element. Then came the ominous dawn of the dreaded fourth day. This stage was designed to be the longest and most isolating test. As he pushed confidently forward, the atmosphere slowly, subtly shifted. The clear blue sky suddenly mutated into a sickly, dense yellow. A low, threatening rumble began to echo across the endless dunes. A fierce wind started to howl, kicking up a massive wall of dust. A notorious, violent Saharan sandstorm had abruptly arrived. Within mere minutes, the entire world around him simply vanished. Blinded by the swirling chaos, he made a fateful, split-second decision. Instead of stopping to wait out the fierce winds, he decided to keep moving, hoping to stay on the course. But the relentless storm instantly erased the track and completely disoriented his sense of direction. For 8 agonizing hours, the tempest raged without mercy. When the dust finally began to settle late in the afternoon, the landscape had transformed into an unrecognizable alien world. There were no markers, no fellow runners, no signs of life. He was utterly alone in the vast expanse. Attempting to remain calm, he consulted his map and compass. He chose a heading, believing it would lead him back to the trail. However, every step he took in the fading light was inadvertently carrying him further away from salvation. As darkness enveloped the desert, the blistering heat surrendered to a freezing chill. He stopped, seeking shelter in a small depression between the dunes. Looking down at his supplies, a grim reality began to set in. He had only half a bottle of water left to his name. Knowing the strict rules of survival, he forced himself to ration every precious drop. The dawn of the 5th day brought the immediate return of the punishing sun. He awoke with a parched throat and a desperate hope for rescue. Suddenly, a faint rhythmic humming broke the deadly silence. A search helicopter materialized on the distant horizon. He leaped to his feet, waving his arms in a frantic plea for help. Desperately, he grabbed his emergency signaling equipment and fired a flare high into the blinding blue sky. But against the overwhelming glare of the midday sun, the flare went unseen, and his only hope slowly vanished into the distance. Left behind in the deafening silence, Mauro faced the crushing reality of his absolute isolation. His meager water supply was now completely exhausted. Severe, life-threatening dehydration began to rapidly ravage his body. Shimmering mirages mocked him with cruel illusions of lakes, driving his exhausted mind closer to the brink of madness. Yet a deep-rooted, stubborn survival instinct forced him to stand once more. Hours later, a distinct silhouette emerged through the distorting heat waves. It was an ancient, abandoned Muslim shrine known as a marabout. Crawling into its cool shade, he finally found a temporary refuge from the burning sun. But a frantic, desperate search revealed absolutely no water inside. Desperate to hydrate his failing, shutting down organs, he resorted to the unthinkable extreme of survival. He collected and drank his own urine, forcing the toxic liquid down his swollen throat. As he lay exhausted on the dusty floor, battling nausea, he noticed a small colony of bats clinging to the dark wooden beams above. Driven by a primal, overwhelming hunger and a desperate thirst, he managed to knock a few of the frantic creatures down. Squeezing their tiny bodies, he drank their raw blood to extract whatever moisture he could. He waited in the shrine for days, his body eating away at its own muscle to survive. Suddenly, the unmistakable roar of a low-flying airplane pierced the sky. Frantically, he set fire to his backpack and sleeping bag to create a massive smoke signal. But a sudden gust of wind scattered the smoke, and the pilot flew right past. Watching his absolute final chance of rescue evaporate into the clouds, Mauro's unbroken spirit finally shattered under the immense weight of despair. Convinced he was doomed to suffer a slow, agonizing death from dehydration, he used a piece of charcoal to write a heartbreaking farewell note to his beloved wife. To spare himself the prolonged torture of dying from thirst, he took a small blade and deeply slit both of his own wrists. He lay down, waiting for the end, completely unaware of the medical miracle about to unfold. Because his body was so profoundly dehydrated, his blood had thickened into a dense, dark paste that refused to flow. When he opened his eyes the following morning, he stared in absolute disbelief at his own clotted wrists. The very desert that was slowly killing him had paradoxically saved his life from his own blade. Viewing this as an undeniable, profound sign to keep fighting, Mauro gathered his absolute last remaining ounce of strength. He abandoned the shrine and stepped back into the blazing furnace. Adopting a desperate new strategy to conserve precious energy, he marched exclusively during the cooler hours of early morning and late evening. During the scorching peaks of midday, he buried himself deep beneath the sand to shield his roasting skin. Yet, his suffering, starved mind continued to brutally betray him. Vivid, heartbreaking hallucinations haunted his waking hours, constantly blurring the fragile line between agonizing nightmares and reality. Driven by pure, unfiltered starvation, he resorted to hunting small desert reptiles with his bare hands. He devoured the lizards and tiny snakes entirely raw, consuming every single part, including the bones, for frantically needed calcium and moisture. He even desperately sucked the sparse morning dew from the dry roots of desert plants. By the 8th day, his physical transformation was deeply horrifying. He had lost nearly 40 pounds, and his blistered feet bled through his torn shoes. Dragging his skeletal frame up the crest of yet another towering sand dune, his sunken eyes suddenly caught a glimpse of something impossible. A faint patch of green vegetation stood out like a beacon against the endless brown. Refusing to believe it was just another cruel, mocking mirage, he stumbled downward with a frantic, completely unhinged energy. He collapsed violently at the muddy edge of a tiny, stagnant watering hole. Plunging his desperate face directly into the murky puddle, he finally tasted life-saving, real water for the very first time in over a week. Quenching his agonizing thirst was a profound relief, but his deeply battered body was still on the verge of complete collapse. The very next morning, an unfamiliar sound broke the desert silence. A young nomad girl, tending to her small flock of goats, fled in absolute terror at the terrifying sight of his skeletal frame. Summoning his final reserves, Mauro slowly tracked her path toward a nearby encampment. There, a family of nomadic herders cautiously approached the desperate stranger. They gently offered him a life-saving bowl of fresh goat's milk. However, his shrunken stomach violently rejected any solid food they tried to provide. Realizing his critical condition, the nomads quickly transported him to the nearest military outpost. When they finally arrived at a heavily guarded military base, officials were completely bewildered by his sudden appearance. Through a translator, Mauro managed to explain that he was a marathon runner. But the officer's response sent a profound shockwave through his fragile mind. He had unwittingly crossed a heavily fortified international border. Mauro was no longer in Morocco. He was deep inside the country of Algeria. Over 9 harrowing days, he had wandered nearly 300 kilometers off course. He was immediately airlifted to a specialized hospital for urgent medical intervention. Doctors were absolutely astounded that his organs hadn't entirely failed. He had lost over 35 pounds and suffered severe liver damage. Yet his only immediate thought was to finally reach out to his grieving family. Hearing his voice was a miraculous resurrection for a family who believed he was dead. The road to physical recovery was agonizingly slow and incredibly painful. It took nearly 2 full years for his body to completely heal from the brutal trauma. But the unyielding spirit that kept him alive in the blistering sands never truly faded away. In a stunning testament to human resilience, Mauro actually returned to complete the very marathon that almost claimed his life. He faced his greatest nightmare, conquered the impossible, and proved that the human will to survive is the most powerful force on Earth.